In the last episode, I showed you how to generate JavaScript dynamically through this eRuby template file. So what we're doing here is just looping through some states and generating dynamic JavaScript through that. Now in this episode, I want to show you how to cache this generated JavaScript so it doesn't have to be processed every single time the user requests it. Now there's three different kinds of caching in Rails. There's page caching, action caching, and fragment caching. Now, page caching is really the most efficient kind of cache, and it's best to use that whenever possible. In this case, it'll work great for page caching because this kind of content is pretty stateless. It doesn't matter who requests this content or how they're requesting it. We always just want to serve this content, and our states models probably won't change very much. So page caching will work really great. We want to just cache this whole JavaScript file here. Okay, to enable page caching, we want to go into our controller and just type caches, page, and then the name of the action you want to cache. So that's just really simple one-liner to enable the page caching for that action. Now there's one last little thing we need to do here, and that is if we want to test this in our development environment, we need to enable page caching in that. So if we go to our development config file, we can see that the perform caching line is set to false. Now in production, it's set to true, but we want to test this, so we need to set it to true temporarily so that we can see if our caching behavior is working properly. And that way, when we reload our server here, page caching should work. So let's test this out. Let's go to our request here, reload that, and if we go in our log here, we can see that there's this cached page line here telling us that this JavaScript was cached at that file. And let's also look in our TextMate here. If we look in the public path in JavaScript, we can see that our dynamic states.js file is now there. And that way, when we request that file again, this time Rails doesn't even know about this request. It's all being processed by the web server, in this case Mongrel. If we look in our log here again, we can see that Rails doesn't even know about it. It's not even touching Rails. Only the first request is shown here. And that'll be much more efficient, much more faster response than if we do it through Rails. So now that we have this file cached here that has all the states, what if we change a state, maybe rename it or give it a different country or so on? Well, in Rails, how you flush the cache or expire a cache is through a sweeper. Now there's really not a good spot to put sweepers in Rails. So let's create a new folder here. I'm just going to call it sweepers. And because I create a new folder, Rails doesn't know about this directory. So we need to tell it about this so that it knows to load any Ruby files it finds in there. So we just go to our environment file here and just type load paths and just specify to load any files we find in our sweepers folder there. And we do that by specifying the full path here, just like that. And this load paths is just an array of the different paths that Rails will load for all these other folders. So just add that there, and then Rails will load the Ruby files found in there. So let's add a new sweeper file in here. Call it state sweeper. So in here I'm going to just run a little TextMate snippet so that generate the sweeper this way. It's just a lot more faster. Okay, what a sweeper does is it observes a model. So in this case, we'll observe our state model. And then after it's either saved or destroyed, then we want to expire the cache. So we do that by calling expire page method. And what we pass to this is the parameters for the URL. So we could just pass controller is the JavaScripts, and the action is the dynamic states. And we'll also want to specify our format so that it knows to append that JavaScript.js extension there. So now whenever our state model's changed, it should expire this cache. But there's one last little thing we need to do here, and that is to, whenever we change our state through our controller, we need to tell it to use the state sweeper. So let's go to our states controller that we have, and this is just basic CRUD operations on our state model. So let's, in this controller, because we're changing the state through this controller, let's add our sweeper cache here, called state sweeper. And then, since we're only doing it on a few actions here, there's the create action, update, and destroy. So those three actions are what changes the state models. And so whenever either of those actions are triggered, it'll trigger our state sweeper here, which will expire the cache for our state model. So that's how you do page caching in Rails and expire the cache when something changes. This episode is sponsored by Peepcode. Please visit peepcode.com and check out their latest screencasts on Ruby on Rails.